In Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, the author attempts to rewrite the story given to African settlers and their taming of the so-called Dark Continent. Achebe was an African-born man living in the United States of America when he took on the challenge of writing a novel based on the colonized Igbo tribe of Amofia from Nigeria. His novel went on to be one of the greatest pieces of African literature. What was his reasoning for it? Through Robert Bennett's literary criticism, an overview of Things Fall Apart, he overlays that the issues of history, culture, and gender have affected Achebe's Things Fall Apart. The thesis is proven through his apparent use of secondary sources, literary devices, and repetition. It is seen that the issues Bennett outlines were key factors in the construction of Things Fall Apart and are apparent throughout the novel. Through Bennett's use of secondary sources, he is able to identify the reasoning behind Achebe's use of historical events as an integral basis for the book. Within Things Fall Apart, it is simple to acknowledge that Achebe's novel is written to show another twist to the common tale of colonization. The frequent narrative is often from the eyes and mind of the colonizer, who will display a vulgar use of words based on their primitive sightings. They do not understand those who are amongst them, as their different culture and beliefs do not pertain to their specific British taste. Achebe attempts to flip the narrative from the colonizers to the colonized. Through this flipping of the role, he is reaffirming African cultures instead of stereotyping them. Bennett uses the words of the author from his frequently quoted essay, The Novelist as Teacher. Chinua profoundly states that this novel seeks to teach Africans that their past, with all its imperfections, was not one night of savagery from which the first Europeans acting on God's behalf delivered them. Through such an exemplary secondary source, Achebe explains the struggles of the African people founded on the basis of European settlement. Europeans twisted the tongue of African tribesmen for so many years, and Achebe, as a writer, had only wanted to give them the voice that they deserved. It was people like the novel's commissioner that dramatized the lives of the African people, amounting to the abundance of stereotypes found with society today. Bennett uses the authorial craft of literary devices as a foundation to prove his arguments. Through the means of his devices, he overlays creative points that show a more in-depth thought process to the reader. He decides to use the device of allusion, which is a reference to anything historically, culturally, or literary. Bennett uses the Oedipus complex to define gender roles within the book, but he does not use the complex one might think. He overlays the myth's division of hate, using the relationships shared between fathers and sons of the novel. Okonkwo showed hate for his father as he believed his ways were too feminine for his liking, while Nemoya rejects his father as he believes he's too masculine for him. Okonkwo is seen as an almost warlike leader in the eyes of the villagers, but behind that image, he is nothing but an overcompensating fool. When Nemoya stands up for himself and leaves his family and father to return home, he follows a similar role to Oedipus in the fact that he fought for his desire. His father's immediate reaction is to demean the decision made by Nemoya by saying, "You have all seen the great abomination of your brother. I will only have a son who is a man, who will hold his head up high among my people. If anyone prefers to be a woman, follow Nemoya." Okonkwo, who has struggled with both sides of gender, resented his father for being feminine in his eyes, now projects those same emotions onto his children. Okonkwo does not understand the roles gender play within his life, and through his over-masculine appearance, he pushes those away who truly love him. In an attempt to bring upon manliness, he hurts the ones he cares for. Through the overuse of repetition, it is understood that the author is leading the reader to a said source. Bennett uses repetition to visualize Okonkwo's struggle to grasping the idea of gender. During Bennett's repetitive reappearing idea, he states, just as there is an external psychological conflict between Okonkwo and his father, there is an internal psychological conflict between the masculine and feminine sides within Okonkwo. The repetition overlays how Achebe gave the character a sense of gender crisis, as he attempts to relay the reasons behind his constant sexist and misogynistic actions toward those who do not follow his perfect image. Okonkwo as a man views the true definition of culture as masculinity, and Achebe idealized the man within the character. Okonkwo breaks rules and destroys peace in order to keep his ideal image of culture and community together, but in his action, he destroys them both. Achebe's character is unable to come to terms with what it means to live within one's own society, as a part of a whole community instead of one man, and that is truly shown as a flaw of his. As Okonkwo cannot overcome the differences within himself, he seemingly crumbles under his own psychological ideals, segregating himself from his culture in the process. In taking his own life, as he had not wanted to come off as feminine for keeping peace, he loses the sort of dignity that he attempted to keep through such an action. Through Okonkwo's overcompensating, he is disgraced, and it is explained that it is an offense against Earth, and a man who commits it will not be buried by his clansmen. Through Okonkwo's struggles between his masculine and feminine sides, he has lost the culture that he had tried to preserve through his death, and now has to be buried like a dog. As a whole, Bennett identifies the proof behind each and every one of his points, as he believed that Achebe's book was based solely on issues of historical events, roles of gender, and the culture of the Igbo people. His arguments can be proven through the use of authorial craft in aspects of his outside sources, literary devices, and the repetition of common ideas. The stories come from deep within, and it is crucial that these stories are told.